You know that Keeley Companies is all about fostering the world-class culture through their incredible cultural pillars. Well, it was time to add a seventh cultural pillar, Keeley Green. Guided by the mission to raise the sustainability standards by which they design, build, operate, and live, Keeley Green is dedicated to using a holistic approach to leave a positive impact on our environment, create a future that is sustainable for generations to come. In the words of Rusty Keeley, we are just getting started. You can learn more about that just getting started mentality and all the work they do by visiting my friends at Keeley Companies online at KeeleyCompanies.com.
Welcome to the Live Inspired podcast with John O'Leary. John is the two-time national best-selling author of On Fire and In Awe. He's a world-class inspirational speaker, the host of the Live Inspired podcast, and he's the real-life inspiration behind the major motion picture Soul on Fire. Each week, John interviews extraordinary individuals about their life stories so you can more fully live your life story. Here's your host, John O'Leary.
Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to the Live Inspired podcast with John O'Leary. Our guest today's name is Mary DeMuth. Yes, she is a best-selling author. Yes, she is an international speaker. Yes, she's the host of a podcast and has devoted her life to helping people heal from difficult stories. And yes, she's got an incredible story to share with you today. It will be deeply inspirational. Mary was a little girl growing up in chaos, navigating abuse, dealing with neglect, handling addiction, and eventually the loss of her dad, among many, many, many other challenges she faced. And yet today, in this episode, Mary shares how to move from victim to survivor and ultimately, you ready, to healer. Why lament is not weakness, but faith refusing to let go. I love that idea. And what forgiveness really looks like in real life. She speaks honestly about trauma resurfacing years after it happened, the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, and how striving to prove your worth can quietly shape your identity. Her words are gentle, they're grounded, they're deeply practical, and they're radically faithful. You're going to love it. My friends, if you are tired of carrying pain in silence or rushing yourself past grief, this conversation's for you. You will leave with courage, with practical wisdom, and with a reminder, you know it's coming, that the best is yet to come. So family, pull your chair up a little bit closer to that podcast radio speaker. Grab your favorite John O'Leary Live Inspired journal. Grab your pen, open up your heart and your mind. As I bring on my friend, now yours, her name is Mary DeMuth. Mary, welcome to Live Inspired with John O'Leary.
It is so good to be here and so great to see you, meet you, talk to you, and know about your story.
Well, I already am seated with a friend. You have a remarkable life story, not all of it easy, much of it difficult and tragic. And then the work you're doing today is prolific. I was going to read this long bio of who you are and all you've accomplished, but instead I'm going to have you do it for yourself. If I happen to bump into you at a coffee shop rather than a podcast, and I said to you, Mary, who are you? How would you respond to that?
Great question. I would say, wife and mom, wife of 35 years, mom of 3 adult kids. And I also wear 5 hats in my job. So I'm a writer, I'm a speaker, I'm a podcaster daily, I'm a literary agent, and I'm an artist. So I've got all those 5 things that I'm doing all the time. I'm trying to reduce those because it's too many. And I love to help people get unstuck and set free from difficult stories. And so I know I'm talking to someone who understands the topography of that. And I guess that's a little bit about what I do and who I am.
When people hear about the topography of your story and the challenges that you've been through recently and been through in the past, they're going to be even more blown away that not only are you still upright, but that you've built a life focusing on getting others to be unstuck and to retell their story differently going forward. It's an amazing journey. So I'm going to give you a quick snapshot into my past, and then I'd like you to tell me about yours. So here we go. 2 parents, one on that side of the table, one on this side of the table, around the dinner table, 5 siblings, golden retriever, 4 grandparents, white picket fence, Midwest upbringing, church on Sundays, pancakes afterwards. Life was awesome. That's my formative years of life. Yours were radically different. So give us a peek into who Mary was as a little one. What was your table like as a little girl?
Wow, the table was chaotic and often not a lot of food on that table. My mom has been divorced several times and was divorced from my father pretty soon after they got married. Remarried someone she met in a laundromat who was unsafe. My father also was unsafe. There was a lot of drug abuse in the home, insecurity and stress and worry and crime, a lot of crime. I was constantly afraid. I'm an only child. And so there also wasn't any siblings to kind of carry me through that. As a 5-year-old, I underwent a year of sexual abuse by these neighborhood older teens that lasted for the entirety of my kindergarten year. Thankfully, we moved away from that place and I didn't encounter that again, except I constantly felt like I had a come get me sign on my head. And so I spent a lot of my childhood running from predatory people. My biological father took his life when I was 10 years old. And then in junior high, where everything's terrible for everyone, I haven't met anyone that's like, my junior high
Yeah,
experience
I
was
killed it.
awesome. But yeah.
Right.
But it was particularly hard for me because my mom's third marriage was on the brink of divorce. They both were never home and they wouldn't get home until like 10 o'clock at night. And so as an only child and a farm with 7 horses and 10 acres and learning how to cook for myself, I was just utterly alone. I was suicidal, very suicidal, and really just I just didn't have anyone in my court. And eventually there was someone in my court, and that was my counselor in 8th grade from my school. And he really saved my life. And then it was the next year that I began to go to Young Life, which is a ministry to high school students. And I began to hear about Jesus. And that's when everything started changing for me. But up until that point, I mean, certainly complex, deep trauma, neglect, abuse, all of those things. And I wish I could say I never get triggered again. I was triggered this week. So
Yeah.
it's been a long journey of healing.
I have a friend whose father took his life when he was a child, and it still haunts him.
Mm-hmm.
I've interviewed folks and have friends who were sexually abused. I have a whole lot of friends whose family endured divorce. And, just because
Mm-hmm.
things are common these days doesn't
Yeah.
make it easy or good for children
Mm-mm,
in these
mm-mm,
families. I have a bunch of friends who grew up without a lot of food, a bunch of
mm-hmm,
friends who grew up with parents who abused drugs.
mm-hmm.
A- And yet you have all of these stories merging as one. And so, kind of a broad question, but as a child navigating all of this, what did you believe about yourself?
I thought that the only reason I was put on earth was to be either completely ignored or perpetrated against. I
Wow.
wouldn't have used those words, but that's exactly how I felt because there was no out for me. And I think it's also why when I did meet a friend in the 3rd grade, I really clung to her. She became a best friend because I literally had nowhere else to go. And, unfortunately, her family was really whacked too. So we just kind of banded together and it was us against the world. But that's really how I thought. And I did not feel protected. And I also truly believed that if anyone was going to take care of me or protect me, it was up to me completely.
Mm.
And that's why, as a 5-year-old, when all those bad things were happening, and I told my babysitter, because it was happening under the watchful eye of a babysitter who actually didn't care and knew it was going on. But I told her what was going on, and she said that she would tell my mom. And the next day, I thought, okay, everything's going to be fine. My mom knows. And the next day, it happened again, and it kept happening. And so the only way I could protect myself, and I mean, I was only 5. I had a lot of moxie for a 5-year-old. I just learned how to sleep, and I just began to sleep the afternoon after half day kindergarten. When the boys would come and grab me, I would just pretend to be asleep. And that was the only way I could save myself, was by that act of sleeping.
I don't want to get into the mindset of the abusers because I don't think it's going to be helpful for our conversation. I am curious though, this babysitter. You mentioned that the babysitter knew what was going on, that you had reported it. and they just
Mhm.
completely ignored it. You've spent now decades healing through this and struggling and fighting and crying and being mad and also growing in compassion through it. Tell me what's going on. What's the psychology of a babysitter who hears their 5-year-old child is being abused and they don't even care to report it?
I think in a way she was a trafficker, so I have a lot of empathy for anyone that's been trafficked because the commodity that she traded was she didn't like children. And these teenage boys took me off her hands. And so for her, they got something out of it, and she got to be free of doing her duty as,
Mm.
of care. I can't think of her any other way of just evil. I don't relate to it all. I cannot understand it. I heard that she didn't tell my mom. That was, a decade later, but in my mind I thought she had. And so then I had all this thoughts of, well, my mom knows and doesn't care. But on the other hand, the other thing that was really hard is there would have been physical evidence of the type of activity that they were doing. So I think my mom should have known or did know, but was too inebriated or stoned to care. And so she just was not curious.
Mm.
It's devastating. It's so devastating.
I'm glad you said, because I was going to ask you about that. You share the story sometimes almost like a courtroom reporter sharing back the
Mhm.
data. And the woman seated in front of me right now at one point was a 5-year-old girl going through it, and then a 6-year-old girl looking back on it, and a 7-year-old girl longing for her dad, and an 8-year-old girl hungry for attention and food and compassion. And so I'm
Um,
assuming that there were long swaths of time where you could barely get through it without just losing it.
Yeah, I was silent about that story until I became a Christian at 15. And so I didn't share it ever. And then you couldn't shut me up. So then I became an oversharer because there was such a
Hmm.
relief in letting it out that I thought, I need to let this out to everybody. And I was probably not as discerning, but that actually ended up for my benefit because there was that. I mean, the first shares for the first several years were very emotional and very sad. And I'm grateful that a lot of the people that heard those stories loved to pray and they just prayed for me, and that a lot of healing happened because of that. But those first shares were highly emotional. And then I went about a decade again where I didn't share it anymore. I kind of made a decision, well, I'm healed. Do, 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 do.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'll never have to revisit this again because I've gone through so much healing. And then my oldest child turned 5 and everything came flooding back. And so then I had to go back into getting help and counseling and all of that kind of stuff.
As you were 15 and 16 and then into your late teens and beyond, was there a person who stepped forward and really took you by the hand and guided you forward? And what did they do effectively to not only lead you forward in your faith, but to lead a broken individual forward in her life?
It was actually a group of people, which is really lovely. And it had to do with people in my church or like Bible study leaders. They must have known that I was on the brink of collapse. They were just different people at different times, maybe for a year at a time, 2 years at a time, depending on where I was living. And they just basically listened a lot and they wept alongside. And they also said, that's terrible.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we can do as listeners is instead of trying to formulate, well, how can I fix this story? Just listen to the story, ask good questions, and then empathize and say, that's a terrible story. I'm sorry, and I'm really mad about it. And because that actually really helped me to experience, someone else's anger on my behalf was very healing.
Mm. When we go away to these teen retreats, I think you went to
Mm.
Life Teen, it's a little bit like a pep rally. That doesn't mean it's not important and you can't truly have an encounter with God. But then eventually you return to schools and you return to the house. When did that faith journey become this like more deeply rooted foundation that you could leap from?
To be honest, for me, it was immediate. And I attribute that to my desperation. I
Wow.
had no dad. I really didn't have a mom. I didn't have a lot of friends. And I was desperate. And so when I met Jesus, interestingly enough, I went outside after I heard about the cross and the resurrection. It was nighttime. I sat myself under a big old evergreen tree Evergreen trees are a terrible symbol for me. That's those boys that abused me. They did it in the woods. And so I definitely know about evergreen trees. And yet how here I am sitting my back up against the very thing that was,
Wow.
symbol of my greatest downfall and pain, and asking Jesus if he would be the dad that wouldn't leave. And so it became fairly immediate only because of desperation. And then I just had this, I mean, I think the Lord just put it in me from the beginning. I just had this need and desire to know him. And I couldn't wait to get my driver's license so that I could drive myself alone to church and find a church. I didn't even know how to find a church. I looked it up in the olden days, in the yellow pages, but I just started going to church. And that was the beginning of just growth. And I would seek it out wherever I moved to. I would find a place where other people who love Jesus were.
Talk to our listeners who don't know what that means to encounter Jesus. You're speaking almost as if he's physically in front of you. Like the way I would say, I encountered Mary today and we had a wonderful and there are some of my Christian friends who talk to God sincerely as if God is directly in front of them, having a conversation back and forth. The Spirit is moving between them. Talk to our friends who may not really understand that on what that would have been like for a young girl leaning up against an evergreen, saying, Jesus, I want you in my life. I want you to be the dad that I never had.
Yeah, it's a bit intangible, I'll grant that. Other than saying in that moment, an overwhelming amount of peace came in. And I just had this knowing of I'm no longer facing life alone and on my own. I no longer have to navigate this very cruel world by myself. And it was just this sweetness of God giving me a little tangible piece of his presence in that, that little hiccup of a moment.
Mm.
And I think there's going to be people listening. They're like, well, I don't experience God. And I get that. I also will say that people who have walked with Jesus for a long time have dark nights of the soul. And I did too. Like there were a couple years there where he felt very distant. Now he was actually doing a lot of work. I couldn't see it, but he was. But there are times where it feels dry, you feel disconnected, and that's just a normal part of walking with the Lord sometimes. And so I don't want people to think, well, I don't feel him, so he's not real. I also am pretty clear about preaching the gospel to myself and believing the truth that he is here. He does love me. He has adopted me. These are the truths. Whether I emotionally feel that way or not, I'm going to preach that to myself.
Mm. You, in some regards, have lived the book of Job.
Mhm.
My understanding is it may have been the first book written in
Yeah,
Scripture,
yeah.
which is pretty wild to think about. For those who wonder, like, how could a good God allow this to happen to you? Like, if there's anything real about this story, this faith that you have in Jesus and God and a loving Father and someone who came into our world and died for our sins, then how could someone like that, a creator like that, allow teenage boys and a complicit babysitter to allow this 5-year-old innocent to go through what she went through, along with everything else she endured afterwards? So how do these two things come together and merge as truth?
Yeah, theologically, I could say that, thankfully, Jesus, it says he went through everything that we went through, yet without sin. So he does understand, and he did hang naked on a cross. He knows what that kind of humiliation is. And so that theological answer is helpful to me, but I also want to dignify the reality of having questions about that. And I still have those questions. They're lessened, but they are still there. And
Mm.
so my question to the Lord as I started working through this healing journey was, I'm a good mom. And if I knew that my kids were being harmed, I would absolutely jump in and I would rescue them because I'm a good mom. If you're a good father and you are the best father that there ever
Yeah.
is, then why didn't you do that for me? And why didn't you do that for hundreds of thousands of other people who have walked through house fires and, all sorts of other things that are painful and scary and awful? He already knows I have that question, so it's okay to have it. And I do understand that I have a tiny glimpse of the whole picture and that I will understand fully another day. I'm probably on the other side. But I think there's a tenderness that happens when you're willing to ask that question of the Lord.
Yeah.
And he hasn't fully answered that question to me, other than the idea that in my case, there is sin in the world and people have free will and they have free willed themselves into my life. And God doesn't violate that free will. So I get all that, but I just want to let people know it is okay to have those questions and it's okay to be perplexed by it.
Well, you mentioned it a few moments ago. You talked about I was healed. Phew, that
Mhm.
was great. And then a decade passed, you had a child, and your oldest turned the age of 5.
Mhm.
How did your baby turning 5 change the way you viewed your baby, viewed your story, viewed life? How did that affect you?
I guess in my mind, I was always thinking kind of, even though I saw pictures of myself at 5, I was always kind of thinking myself back as a little adult with an adult ability to grasp what was going on. And I was pretty smart, so I did know what was going on. But when I physically saw a child at 5 living in my home all day long, all night long, I realized just how vulnerable and small, I mean, just physically small, and
Yeah.
how I didn't have a chance. And it just broke me of it was like this final realization of, oh, I wasn't a little adult when this happened. I was a little child. So that
Yes.
is what triggered me back to that.
Mm. And then what do you do with that? You said even I was triggered earlier this week, John. And then when you're recounting the story of when you had a 5-year-old and this sweet little innocent in front of you and it triggered you again, when you went through this, then what? How do you then take the next right step forward? Because I'm asking this for those of us who are going through a similar experience, that we're triggered. We have these flashbacks. We have these moments that just break us. And then what?
Yeah, the easy, well, I guess easy answer is counseling, but economically, my husband and I couldn't afford that. And so my decision then became, I'm going to read every book I can find about this, and I'm going to do every workbook, and I'm going to ask people that are farther along in the journey than I am to help me with this because I really didn't know what to do. And I
Yeah.
did learn a lot. Eventually, I was able to go to counseling when my husband was at seminary and they allowed spouses to go to counseling at the seminary for free. But up until that point, I didn't have that economic viability to do that. The other thing I would say as to what I do now when I'm triggered is I try to walk through the lament psalm.
Mm.
And a lament psalm is a psalm that begins with, why, God, why? And it ends with, but you are good. And I think what happens to us a lot is we jump onto the Christian cliche wagon and we say everything's going to work out for the good. We kind of preach it to ourselves. We also do it to other people,
Right.
which is not good. But we start there and then we suppress the story. So we start at God is good, and we, instead of eventually having it all explode in us having to do the lamenting, I think God gives us a framework. We start with the lament. We don't suppress it. We say, this hurts.
Mm.
I'm in pain. Please pray for me. And so I let it out. I tell someone, I write about it, I do something, and then I work through it until I get back to the yes, God is good. But the opposite way doesn't work very well.
All right. Good. Well said. You mentioned you write about it. I've interviewed, I think, 850 guests on our podcast. I don't think I've ever interviewed anyone who is as prolific a writer as you are. You write about it a lot. When did you recognize your ability to write?
When I gave birth to my first child, immediately I was like, I need to write a book. So I spent a decade working on my craft. I was an English major, so there was some talent in there somewhere. And then I started publishing books from about 2004 forward, and I've been writing 2 or 3 books a year from that point on. And I make a joke that every time I write a book, God heals me of something. And so the reason I've written over 50 books is that I'm a big fat mess and it's a way I process my pain. And so the Lord knew I needed to write a lot of books to get through all this.
You didn't write a whole book about it, but you wrote a letter about it. You wrote a letter of forgiveness to your abusers.
Mhm.
So first of all, why? And then you haven't seen them, I don't think, since then. But why write that letter and tell us what you wrote within it?
Yeah, that was many years coming before I did that. That was just a few years ago. So that was decades after. First, I just want to say to people that are being pressured to forgive, no one gets to tell you when to forgive. That's your journey and it's between you and God. And it is very abusive to say, well, you just need to forgive.
Can I ask you, because I had a feeling you might begin with that. Why is it so important for you to let those of us who've been burned in one way or
Mhm.
another recognize that, hey, no one has the power to tell you when you need to let go of that hurt? Why is
Yeah.
that important for you to begin your answer with those words?
I think it gives you agency to be on a journey that's complicated. And I think we as humans, we want to streamline everything. We want to make it into a little process, run the bases and all of that. And we want things quickly healed and wrapped up. And so it's not mean to say you need to forgive. It's just not an understanding of the trauma journey. And also it doesn't understand the pathway of forgiveness. And the pathway of forgiveness is I may have chosen to forgive someone on May 15th of 2020. But then last week I get triggered.
Yeah,
And what I used to think was, oh, I would beat myself up and say, oh, this must mean I haven't forgiven. What I know now is that, yes, I made a choice on May 15th, 2020 to forgive. This is another layer of forgiveness that I'm choosing to forgive. And
yeah,
so forgiveness is deeply layered. And, there's still layers for me to forgive those abusers. As to the question of why did I write that, I felt like I was ready finally to do it. But if you read the letter, it still has anger in it. There's still
yeah.
a righteous anger of what the heck you did was terrible. And I don't agree with what you did. And it deeply, deeply wounded me. So it didn't dismiss the trauma, it talked about the trauma. But I know that for me personally, I can't live in a cloud of ire and unforgiveness for the rest of my life, or I'll
Right.
never move on and I'll be tied to them forever. So I've been gradually throughout the years, I have been on that forgiveness journey so that that tie gets smaller and smaller as I get older and older.
Help me understand the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation.
Yeah, so forgiveness is on my side only. And if you came up to me today and punched me in the face, which would be really unkind, but if you did that, I could forgive you, but until you repent of that and say, "Oh my gosh, I don't know what I was thinking. I shouldn't have done that. Please forgive me." Now, there's that possibility there of reconciliation, but that takes two. Forgiveness is your own little journey of what you're going to do with your bitterness.
Mm. What do you do with your bitterness? Because if you are at all human, then you have some. And here you are such an expert on understanding scripture and helping us unpack it so we can live it more fully and abundantly and joyfully, even through the heartache in our lives. So when bitterness rears its ugly face in front of you, what do you do with your bitterness?
I usually go running. Running really helps actually. And there's some research out there, if you know anything about EMDR, which is the eye tracking counseling that you recall a memory and you track your eyes. There's been some research that's saying that running has that same kind of tracking. And so it helps you kind of work through a bad memory. So I do that and I process in community with good people that are safe. And yeah, I do write it out on the page. It is most helpful to me to do that. And I know not everyone is a writer. Some people are artists and some people are singers and some people are athletes or whatever. But I believe that God gives you these beautifully unique gifts as the avenue to heal you. And so he did
Mm,
that for me, which is really lovely to give me the gift of communication. And that beautiful gift that he gave was the means by which he healed me.
mm. You've written, I think, more than 4 dozen books, which is a crazy thing to say aloud,
Mhm.
including a cool series on women within scripture.
Mhm.
Uh, We could spend a whole podcast talking about this, but is there one in particular when you're telling your friends about, my gosh, have you thought about this woman? Is there one who you just connect with? Like she's just someone that you think about frequently and you're grateful that she is part of your life.
The woman at the well is really compelling to me because she's been pretty misunderstood. She's been portrayed as promiscuous, and a lot of people have just kind of believed that. But if you look at some of the scholarship out there and you think about it a little bit more logically, about what that culture was like during that time, most likely she was unable to bear a child. And at that time, you could give a certificate of divorce for any sort of reason. And if your wife can't give you an heir, then she's broken and you can't use her to, create an offspring. And so most likely, although we can't prove it, I'll ask her on this other side when I get to heaven, but most likely that story of multiple divorces was a traumatic story of being abandoned.
Mm.
And she has this conversation with Jesus that is the longest theological conversation recorded in the Gospels with Jesus between anyone. And so that's what I just love about her. She doesn't have any sort of reticence to go back to her village and say, "Come see a man who told me everything about myself." There was no shame in that. She asks him these great theological questions. You say worship here, I say here. And he basically tells her he's the Messiah. I mean, it's just really profound and an amazing story. And here she is so broken. And then she becomes the first missionary and she runs around and tells everyone about it. And then the town says, "Well, we first started believing because of stuff you said, but now we've encountered Jesus
Mm.
and now we follow him because of who he is." And so she was a perfect missionary. She wasn't pointing to herself, she was pointing to Christ.
That's so good. I've never heard that story unpacked like that. That's
Mm.
beautiful. Many of the ladies that you write about have very little social power. They weren't in positions of influence. So what
Mhm.
does their courage teach us about influence in our world today?
I think we live in a very bombastic culture of loud and flashy and platforms and celebrity, and we're really obsessed with it. But I believe that the kingdom is upside down. And those little acts of obedience and those little defiances of I'm going to stand up for injustice, those actually really do matter. And we know from kingdom math that little is much in the hands of God, and bombastic fame is nothing to him because
Mm.
he's the famous one. And so I think we've gotten it all wrong. We've given praise and glory to the wrong set of folks. And I think when we get to the other side, we're going to be really surprised who's first and who's last. And we just have to train ourselves to remember that every little act of obedience
Yeah.
is significant in the kingdom. It may be unheralded and unseen, but it matters.
I had the honor, and I underline that word, of speaking at a prison just like a week and a half ago. And as I'm hugging these guys afterwards, wearing my nice slacks and my nice, relatively new shoes and my tucked in shirt, and they're coming up with outfits that they probably received when they checked in years and years and years ago, and they'll never be checking out. I think every one of these guys is closer to God than I am.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it stinks to say that. I wish that
Mhm.
was not true. But in hugging these guys one after another, that's how I felt. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say definitely I agree with that. And probably the most profound speaking I've ever done has been in prisons and for me, incarcerated women. And wow, I mean, just I think it gets back to the beginning part of my story where you're like, well, how do you experience Christ? It was that desperation married to the heart of God is a really beautiful thing.
Mm.
And I now can thank the Lord for my story because it caused me to reach heavenward. If everything was all easy and, not hard, would I have? I don't know. I can't know that, but I also know that in that desperate reach, I was met.
Mm. You wrote a book, number 614, called Restory Your Life. It's the one that I had access to. I got to read through it. And just two questions around that. The first one is why? You could have written about any of these women, any of these men. You could have written about the fish you swallowed, Jonah. You could have done anything you wanted, but you now wrote about Restore Your Life. Why is that the most recent topic that matters?
Yeah, it's actually been a topic that's gone on in my mind for almost a decade now, and the Lord dropped that little word into my head. And it means that He gives, obviously, it means He gives us a new story. But for a while, it was like I was living as a victim, which is normal. Absolutely. I had a lot of things that happened. And then the Lord began healing that, and I was on this healing journey. And then I had this aha moment when the Lord was giving me this word, restory, that it's not for me. This healing and this new journey that I've been on is for you and for other people. And I cannot recount to you how much joy, and you probably feel the same way when you're in front of the prisoners, how much joy it is that God would use your broken, terrible story for the good of others. We are restoried to help others restore. We are set free so that we can be emancipators. We are healed so that we can be healers. There's a so what to our story. There's this forward kingdom momentum, and that's the whole point of the book.
For those of us who long for a little bit more of a restory in our journeys, what's a daily practice that you're committed to that helps you live into this?
It's one of the things that helped me was reading the book, The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. It's really short, so anyone could probably get it free because I think it's in the public domain. And he just talks about how we should talk to Jesus when we're doing the dishes, and we should talk to Jesus when we're out in the garden, and we should talk to Jesus, just have this continual conversation with him throughout the day. And I'm very toddlerish in it. I don't feel like I've grown up well, and I still have big swaths of time where I'm not chatting with Jesus, but having that conversation with him, giving him the perplexity in the moment has been a really good practice for me.
On our podcast, we're super intentional on bringing on friends from every faith background. We're super intentional on making room for people that have no faith background and to have a conversation together around life. For those of us who don't have a faith or they proclaim a different faith than the one you profess,
Mhm.
what would you say? So you're meeting them now at the well, and I'm going to step away, and it's just the two of you talking. You put your arm around them. What do you want to say to them?
I don't actually want to say anything. I want to listen and dignify their story. And I think one of the cool things that you can do, and this is a practice I did in college, and it doesn't have to involve faith, but we had this indoor running place because I was in the Pacific Northwest and it rained all the time. So we had this indoor running track. It was an eighth of a mile. And every time I would run an eighth of a mile, I would recount a year of my life. And at first, it was just recounting all the bad things. And eventually, as I kept running, I began to see positive things in that story. For me, I was looking at how God was intersecting that story. But for anyone, they could look up and say, what is good about me being born? What is good about the fact that I moved away after those horrible things happened to me, that I was rescued there? And just being able to pick out the positive parts of your story as you run laps around your childhood.
That's so good. So listen, I told you, you have way too many books, way too many podcasts for me to get through all the content, way too many questions for me to ask, and way too many quotes to say, tell me more. But I'm going to wrap up with three quotes from you and then seven questions called the Live Inspired Seven.
Okay.
So these are three of your quotes. Tell me what they mean. Lament is not the absence of faith. It is faith refusing to let go.
Hmm. Gosh, I wrote that. That's awesome. Good job, me. And that's true. I think it's really true
By
that
the
we
way, don't
don't
you love when someone quotes back your words and you're like,
like,
dude,
hey,
I
that's
had no
pretty
idea I
good.
was smart.
That's really
So
good.
much better than something I would have normally written.
I think we think that we have to be perfect in the way we handle life in order to be a good specimen of a human. But I actually think a good human is one who laments and cries and weeps when things are hard. That's authenticity, that's reality. And we're not going to grow beyond the things we shove down. We have to lament them.
Well, quote number two, we silence victims when we rush them past their grief.
Mm. Yes, it's so true. And that's a mandate, I think, for all of us who are good friends, that it is uncomfortable to hear someone's grief story. It is broken, and we do not like it, and we do want to rush them to the next pillar of strength. But it is so important that we sit with them. And we see this in the book of Job, where Job's friends at the beginning, he lost everything, and then his friends came and he was sitting in a hole and he was really sad and scraping his wounds and crying all the time. And his friends just sat there with him. That's all they did. Then everything got bad because then they started talking. And the whole rest of the book of Job is them saying a bunch of judgmental things about Job and saying he's a big sinner and he deserved all this. And at the end, Job says, he says, I knew you by the hearing of the word. Now I know you by the seeing. So he used to hear God, but he ended up after all that by seeing God. And his friends started well, but they ended poorly. And the Lord reprimanded those friends. So I don't know. It's just an interesting thing to think about.
That's beautiful. Final quote is, "You are not what was done to you."
Mhm. I'm so grateful for that, and I'm sure you are as well, because it is pretty heady, and you will get attention if you wear the badge of victimhood. And I think there's a time to wear that badge. Like you have to get through it somehow. You have to talk about it. But there's a time to grow up beyond it too. I am not all those things that happened to me. I'm so much more. And I've been so healed throughout the whole journey that I feel like the reason I can antiseptically share that story is that God has done so much healing. It's just amazing.
Mary, we have 7 questions that we leverage and we guide all of our guests through them. They're called the Live Inspired 7. So here we go.
Okay.
Number one, for a prolific writer, what's been the most impactful book you've ever read?
I mean, obviously the Bible is one, the most important one, but I would say I'm a novelist as well. And so To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee was very important to me, as well as Peace Like a River by Leif Enger. So both novels that are talking about outcasts and people from the outskirts turning out to be saviorific, salvific, I guess is a better way to put it, who rose above circumstance to do the right thing and to act justly.
Within the Bible, that I know you have this practice where you can race through the Bible. You've read it
Mhm.
many, 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 many times. If there was one book within it that you would encourage people to check out, where would you send them first?
It's kind of an odd one, but it's Second Corinthians. And in that book, it talks so much about our weakness being married to God's strength. It's my favorite book of the Bible.
What is one positive characteristic or one positive trait that that little girl outside of Seattle possessed growing up that you wish you exhibited as brilliantly today?
I guess it's just moxie, just this resilience, I would say, making it through all those things. And I hope that I'm as resilient as she was back then. She went through a lot.
Yes, you did. Mary, if your home caught fire and all living things are out, your kids, your family, and the animals, and you have an opportunity of running back inside and grabbing one item, one thing, what would you grab?
Well, I know my laptop is backed up to the cloud, but one can never be so sure. So I would probably grab my laptop because all of my life's work is on there.
If you could sit on a bench on a gorgeous day and have a long conversation with anyone living or deceased, who do you want to have seated next to you?
I'm sure the answer to that question is going to be different anytime you ask it at different points in my life. But weirdly, today I would say Abraham Lincoln. So he did a miraculous thing in a broken, divided country. And he dared to do something really hard that had lots of consequences, but it was the right thing to do.
I kind of wish instead of American history floating through 300 years or whatever they even teach in third grade now, that we
Mhm.
spent more time really focusing on central characters within it. If
Yeah.
people learned truly about Lincoln and what that fella faced and where the country was and the issues that
Mhm.
divided and what he insisted we could become, we would feel far better about the days we have today and what's possible
Right.
tomorrow.
And that's why I said that, because it's just been weird politically and things are hard all over the world, not just in America. So,
For
yes.
sure. Perfect. What's the best advice Abraham Lincoln, Uncle Abe, or anyone else ever gave you?
Yeah, he hasn't talked to me at all recently or at any time.
Four score and 7 years ago, Mary.
Yes, I don't even know what fourscore is, so that doesn't work. It's not necessarily advice, but it's something my husband said to me that was really helpful. After newly getting married, he said that his goal was, he said, I know that the first half of your life was really hard. My goal is that the rest of your life is full of joy and that I could be a part of that. And that he's been very consistent about changing the narrative of family life for me.
I had 4 different questions about Patrick and 5 different questions about generationally changing what happens afterwards to make sure your
Mm-hmm.
kids are different than their mom in the most
Mm-hmm.
beautiful way.
Mm-hmm.
I wish we had more time for that because there's so much land there to cover.
Yeah.
I'm grateful for Patrick's love of you and his commitment for your joy and your
Mm-hmm.
future.
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you give yourself at age 20?
quit being so stressed out. I was constantly so stressed out and such a perfectionist, such a do-gooder, which is lovely. I mean, that's good to be a do-gooder, but I was still in that place of performance and believing that if I could justify my space on earth and taking up this spot by doing a lot of really great things, it was almost holding me hostage.
Mm. What would you say to someone who's being held hostage right now in that same mindset? Because the reality is many folks listening to this podcast are achievers. They,
Yeah.
they just want to get after it. It's not for the trophies, but they are running. They are running fast through life. So what would be your advice to them?
I think it's okay to be an achiever. I think it's okay. I'm definitely made this way, and it's something to celebrate. It's when it gets to this point of tying it to your identity that where you run into trouble.
That's good.
And so I would say you are loved by the people around you, not for what you produce, but by simply who you are and how you show up in people's lives. And so your worth is based on your soul, not on what your embodiedness
Right.
creates.
Mary DeMuth, author of dozens and dozens of books, including most recently Restory. It has been said that all great people can have their lives summed up in one sentence. How would you like your one sentence to read?
She loved Jesus. That's it.
Here's this mom and this wife and this daughter, this survivor, this podcast host, all the things Mary does, 5 different jobs that she's currently managing right now, juggling balls while leading, and she loved Jesus.
Mhm.
Mary, I'm glad that even under those evergreens when you were 5, he was there. And 10 years later, he was with you again, and then he's still with you today. You reminded
Mhm.
us, that I think Jesus is with all of us, regardless of where we are in our walk.
Thank you.
My friends, that is Mary DeMuth. Her most recent book is called Restore Your Life. My name is John O'Leary, and today is your day. What a gift. Live with your soul on fire.
Well, Mary DeMuth reminded me and hopefully us that when life hurts, we don't have to rush past it or pretend we're fine. Instead, we can practice something called lament. And it's basically this: name what's hard, ask the honest questions, and then keep choosing to walk forward. It's not weakness, it's not lack of faith, it's strength, and it's the right next step. This is what hurts right now. This is what I wish might be different. This is what I need today. That's it. No fixing, no polishing, just honesty, because healing doesn't start with pretending. It starts with telling the truth. My friends, if you enjoyed today's episode, you will love the conversation I had years ago with Bonnie Gray. Growing up as a Chinese-American daughter of a mail-order bride. You heard that right. Bonnie's childhood was far from idyllic. This conversation is a reminder that in boldly owning, embracing, and celebrating our stories, we are gifted the chance to live authentically and breathe life and breathe possibility into not only our stories, but into others. You can check out the Bonnie Gray episode at 412, or for you internet savvy listeners, you can cruise with me right now over to the website, johnolearyinspires.com/podcast. We'll have a link in the show notes today for that. Just as a reminder, if you haven't subscribed to our podcast, do it now. It's to ensure that these little episodes end up in your lap week after week. So subscribe. And if you haven't rated or told your friends about this podcast, do it now. In a marketplace with negativity and divisiveness and cynicism, we have a message of hope, of togetherness, and of truth that the best is yet to come. So family, for this time and until next time, my name is John O'Leary. Today is your day. What a gift it is.
Keeley Companies was started almost 50 years ago by the one and only Larry Keeley. What started as a small family-owned paving company in St. Louis has grown to a nationally known full-service construction, development, and restoration partner. Larry the Legend, as he is affectionately known, has been a part of this growth every step of the way and continues to provide guidance as his son, Rusty, my buddy, drives their vision and achieves results on purpose. His unwavering foundation of a family culture with a focus on people has gotten Keeley Companies to where they are today, and their journey is truly just beginning. To learn more about Larry the Legend and Keeley Companies, check them out at KeeleyCompanies.com.